Chapter 1. What the storm kept. The children were heavier now. Not because they had grown in the hours since Lottie had found them huddled beneath the collapsed pine, shivering and barely conscious. They were still small, still heartbreakingly light. But her arms had been carrying them for 3 miles through the blizzard, and her legs remembered every step of it. She shifted the smallest one, a boy no older than 4, his dark curls matted with ice, higher on her back. He had stopped whimpering an hour ago, which frightened her more than the crying had. His breath still fogged against her neck. That was enough. That had to be enough. The other 2, a girl of perhaps 6 with a gash on her palm that Lottie had wrapped in a strip of her own undershirt, and a boy of 7 who had insisted on walking until his knees gave out, pressed against her sides, their small fingers gripping the coarse wool of her travel cloak. She could feel them trembling even through the fabric. The wind came in waves, each one colder than the last. The pines around her groaned and bent, shedding white sheets of snow that blurred everything beyond 10 feet. She couldn't feel her toes anymore. She wasn't sure she wanted to. Keep moving, she told herself. That's all. Just keep moving. She didn't let herself think about where she was heading. She didn't let herself think about the fires that would be burning inside that great hall, or the smell of wood smoke curling from its chimneys, or the warmth of stone walls thick enough to hold the cold out. She couldn't afford hope. Hope had a way of slowing her feet. She thought instead about the sound the little girl had made when Lottie had pulled her free from beneath the collapsed branch. A soft, broken sound, like something giving way. And the way her eyes had gone wide with terror before recognizing she wasn't in danger anymore. That sound. That look. That was the only compass Lottie needed. She had lived alone at the edge of the forest for 2 years. She knew how to find firewood in a storm. She knew how to seal the gaps in her shelter with pine needles and mud, how to stretch a rabbit for 3 days, how to sleep through hunger without losing her mind. She had learned all of it the hard way after the pack cast her out. She had not, in 2 years, crossed the boundary line, until tonight. The great hall emerged from the white dark like a memory she had tried to forget. A massive structure of dark stone and heavy timber, its roof pitched steeply against the weight of mountain winters, firelight bleeding gold from every window. She could smell it before she could see it clearly. Wood smoke, roasted meat, pine resin, the distinctive warm musk of wolf that she hadn't breathed since she was 23 years old, and someone had told her she wasn't worth keeping. Her step faltered. The boy on her back stirred. "Is that—" He mumbled against her shoulder. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "That's home." "Not mine," she added silently. "Yours." She walked to the door and pushed it open. The sound that hit her was not what she expected. She had prepared for shouting. For panic, the controlled chaos of a pack mobilizing search parties, alpha commands cutting through the noise like blades. She had braced herself for that, for the shock on their faces when they saw who had walked through their door. What she found instead was silence, or something close to it. 40 people stood or sat throughout the hall, gathered in tight clusters near the great hearth and along the long tables. Some held cups they weren't drinking from. Some stared at the fire. Some had their faces buried in their hands. Children pressed against the sides of adults, wide-eyed and unnaturally still. The pack was grieving. Already. Nobody heard the door open at first. Then the little girl beside Lottie let out a sound. Not a word, just a note of recognition, small and desperate. And her grandmother, a silver-haired woman near the hearth, turned. The woman's face broke open. And then the hall erupted. Bodies surged forward. The girl was swept up. The boy from Lottie's back was lifted away by strong hands before she could even process that the weight was gone. The 7-year-old was gathered in, and voices rose around him, crying, laughing, names repeated over and over in relief so raw it made Lottie's chest ache. She stepped back automatically, giving them room, and her heel caught the threshold behind her. She was still standing in the doorway, half in the cold, when the silence found her. It moved outward from the center of the room like a ripple. One by one, faces turned toward her. She recognized some of them. She had grown up beside some of them, trained in the eastern courtyard with others, shared meals with a few of the older ones who now stared at her as if they weren't sure what they were looking at. She became aware, suddenly, of how she must appear. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, half frozen. Her cloak was soaked through and torn at the hem where she'd caught it on a rock in the dark. Her boots had split along the left sole, and she'd been walking on a wet foot for the last mile. Snow was still melting off her shoulders and dripping from her fingers onto the stone floor. She lifted her chin. She would not look away first. She had stopped doing that a long time ago. Lottie. The voice came from the far end of the hall. She had not let herself look for him. She had been very deliberate about that, scanning the edges of the room, the clusters of people, anything but the tall, dark shape near the fire that her instincts had located the moment she stepped inside. But now she had no choice. Aiden stood with his hands braced against the long wooden table, his knuckles pale, his amber eyes fixed on her with an expression she couldn't name. He was exactly as she remembered, and somehow more. Broader across the shoulders, the lines of his face sharper, a weariness around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. He wore a dark wool tunic belted with leather, and the silver ring of the Alpha King on his right hand caught the firelight as he straightened slowly to his full height. He was staring at her the way people stared at impossible things. "You were beyond the boundary," he said. Not an accusation. Not quite. "Yes," Lottie said. The fire crackled. A child hiccuped somewhere behind her. "You found them." His voice had dropped. Whatever the room had been expecting him to say, it wasn't that. The pine at the northern ridge came down across the deer trail. They were sheltering under the crown. She kept her tone even, the same way she used to report to the senior hunters before everything fell apart. The youngest was showing signs of cold sickness. He needs warming slowly, not too fast near the fire. The girl's hand needs proper wrapping. I used what I had, but the cut is deep. She watched him absorb this. She watched the muscle in his jaw shift. "You came back," he said, quieter now, so that only the nearest people could have heard it. She met his gaze. "I came to return what wasn't mine to keep." The words were careful, precise. She had not rehearsed them, but they were exactly right, and she saw from the slight movement of his throat that he understood both what she meant and what she had deliberately not said. The hall was completely silent. Then the silver-haired grandmother pushed through the crowd to Lottie's side and took her frozen hands between her own warm palms and began to cry. Lottie stood very still and let her. She did not look at Aiden again, but she felt his gaze on her like the warmth from a fire she wasn't allowed to stand near. Chapter 2. The Weight of What Was Owed. The pack healer, a woman named Bryn with ink-stained fingers and sharp, kind eyes, took charge quickly. She moved through the hall, issuing instructions in a low, unhurried voice that cut through the emotional noise more effectively than any shout. The 3 children were brought to the healer's room off the east corridor. The grandmother, her name was Maren, Lottie would learn. She had raised all 3 of them since their parents died in the same storm 2 winters past, followed without once letting go of the little girl's hand. Lottie remained near the door. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Permission to leave, perhaps. Or maybe some part of her was simply too tired to decide anything. A cup appeared before her. Clay, rough-fired, steaming with something that smelled of pine and honey, and something sharper underneath. An old healer's tea. She followed the hand, holding it up to the face of a young woman about her own age, with broad shoulders, a warrior's stance, and suspicious dark eyes. "Drink it," the woman said, not warmly. Lottie took the cup. "Thank you. It's not kindness." Her voice was low, but her gaze was direct and cool. "Bryn's orders. She doesn't want you collapsing on the hall floor. It would complicate things. I understand." Lottie wrapped her cold hands around the clay and felt the warmth crawl up her wrists. "What's your name?" The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, as if being asked a simple question were somehow a tactic. Sina. I know who you are. Sina crossed her arms. Everyone in this hall knows who you are. The words weren't cruel exactly, but they weren't gentle either. They were the truth, stated plainly, which in some ways was harder to receive than cruelty. Lottie drank the tea. She could feel the pack watching her from the edges of the hall, in the way wolf packs always watched uncertain things, not staring outright, but present, tracking. She had grown up beneath this kind of attention. She had forgotten how exposed it made her feel. She stays. The voice came from behind her. She turned. Aiden stood 3 feet away, closer than she had realized. Close enough that she could see the faint scar along his left jaw she'd never noticed before, and the way his amber eyes were darker at the center than she remembered. He wasn't looking at her now. He was looking at Sina, and his expression was the quiet, absolute kind that didn't invite argument. Sina's jaw tightened. Alpha. Until the storm passes and Bryn clears the children, she stays. A pause. She is to be given a room, dry clothes, and food. Those are not suggestions. Sina held his gaze for one measured moment, then lowered her chin and stepped back. Aiden turned to Lottie. Up close. The weariness in his face was starker. A man who had spent the last several hours holding something together by sheer will, and was now, just barely, allowing himself to breathe. The north wing has a guest room, he said. Sina will show you. Lottie studied him carefully. And in the morning? Something shifted behind his eyes. In the morning, we'll talk. She almost asked what they would talk about, but she didn't, because she already knew there were many things between them that had never been spoken, and she wasn't certain either of them was ready for that conversation yet. All right, she said. He nodded once. Then he looked at her. Really looked. At her frozen hair, her ruined cloak, the exhaustion she hadn't entirely managed to suppress, and something crossed his face too quickly for her to read. You could have sent them on alone once they were close enough to see the lights, he said quietly. Yes, she agreed. But you didn't. She met his eyes. No. He said nothing else, but he didn't look away, and neither did she, and the fire behind him burned on between them like a question neither had yet found the words for. Finally she turned and followed Sina down the cold stone corridor. For the first time in 2 years, Lottie was inside walls that didn't belong to her. She told herself that didn't mean anything. She told herself that all the way to the door of the guest room. She almost believed it. Chapter 3. Old wounds, fresh edges. The room was small and cold when Sina pushed the door open, but a fire had already been laid in the iron grate, and whoever had prepared it had done so quickly. The flames were young, still finding their shape. A wool blanket sat folded on the narrow bed. A wooden basin waited on the table with a pitcher of water that steamed faintly. Someone had done this before Aiden gave the order. Lottie noticed that. She filed it away and said nothing. Sina set a bundle of dry clothing on the chair by the fire, rough linen shirt, thick wool trousers, wool stockings, and moved toward the door without ceremony. Sina. The woman stopped, but didn't fully turn. The 3 children, Lottie said. The boy who was on my back. He was barely responding toward the end. How is he? A pause. Sina's shoulders moved slightly, something releasing in them that she hadn't intended to show. Bryn says he'll be fine. They all will. She said it flatly, the way people stated things they were profoundly relieved about but refused to display. Good, Lottie said simply. Another pause. Longer this time. You walked 3 miles, Sina said, not turning around. In that storm. With all 3 of them. Yes. Why? The question wasn't grateful. It wasn't hostile either, exactly. It was the specific tone of someone who needed to understand something that didn't fit the shape of what they'd already decided. Lottie sat on the edge of the bed and began working the laces on her ruined boot with fingers that were still half numb, because they were in the cold and I was warm enough to help. "You were rejected," Sina said. "Cast out. This pack owes you nothing. You owe this pack nothing. You had every reason to leave them there, or to simply send them toward the lights and disappear." "I know." "Then why?" "Because it wasn't about the pack." Lottie pulled the boot free and set it on the stone floor. Her sock was soaked through, and the cold had left the skin of her foot a mottled pale. "It was about 3 children in the snow. That's all." Sina turned then. She looked at Lottie the way she might examine something she'd expected to be one thing, and found to be another. Not softer, but recalibrating. Storing the information somewhere it wouldn't be easily retrieved. "Sleep," she said finally. "Bryn will want to check you in the morning regardless." She left, pulling the door closed behind her with deliberate quiet. Lottie sat alone in the firelight and let out a breath she'd been holding since the hall. Her hands were shaking now that there was no one to see it. The kind of shaking that came after everything was already over. The body catching up to what had happened, demanding its dues. She changed into the dry clothes, wrapped herself in the wool blanket, and lay down on the narrow bed. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay and listened to the storm work itself against the shuttered window, and she thought, against her better judgment, about the way Aiden's face had looked when she walked through that door. Not the measured control she'd expected from a man who had cast her out 2 years ago. Something rawer than that. Something she didn't trust herself to name. She had been 23 when the council voted. Aiden had been 26, newly crowned Alpha King after his father's death, navigating a pack with 3 rival factions still jostling for influence. The official reason for her rejection was status. She was an Omega, unranked, without family connections, and the ruling council had decided that a lone Omega with no loyalty anchor was a liability the new king couldn't afford to carry. They had said it very cleanly, very reasonably. Aiden had not been in the room. She had told herself, later, that this mattered, that it changed something. On the worst nights, she had believed it. On the better nights, she understood that absence was its own kind of answer. She pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes. In the morning, she told herself. Think about it in the morning. But the fire in the grate crackled and shifted, and for a long time, the dark behind her eyelids kept showing her amber eyes, asking questions she didn't know how to answer. Chapter 4. The Council Remembers. Councillor Drevin was a careful man. He had been carefully sitting beside important men for 30 years, careful enough that most of them forgot he had opinions of his own. He had outlasted 2 Alpha Kings, 4 pack wars, and an epidemic that had taken a third of the eastern settlement. He had outlasted all of them by being indispensable and invisible in equal measure, a skill he had spent a lifetime honing to something close to an art. He sat now at the long oak table in Aiden's private council chamber, turning a gold ring around the middle finger of his left hand in a slow, rhythmic rotation. The fire in this room burned lower than the one in the great hall. He preferred it that way. Shadows were useful. 3 children recovered. Aiden stood at the window, his back to the room, watching the storm. He hadn't sat down since they'd assembled. Unharmed. The pack mourned, and now it does not need to. By any measure, this is a good night. By most measures, said Councillor Drevin. Aiden turned. Drevin allowed the pause to breathe before he continued. He was patient, above all else. The woman, my lord, Lottie, her return, even temporary, raises questions that the pack will begin asking by morning. Questions about status, about the original ruling, about why a rejected Omega was permitted entry, and given a guest room rather than simply thanked at the threshold and sent back to the tree line. He spread his hands gently on the table. I raise this not to diminish what she did tonight. What she did tonight was extraordinary. But extraordinary acts by complicated individuals create complicated situations. She saved 3 children, said Sana from the far side of the table. Drevin looked at her mildly. Sana had only been on the council 4 months. She still said things directly, without architecture. He would not hold it against her. Yet. She did. And I am grateful. I am also required by my position to think past gratitude toward consequence. What consequence? Sina's voice was controlled but not warm. She asked for nothing. She's sleeping in a guest room. When the storm lifts, she'll leave. Will she? Drevin tilted his head. My Lord Aiden, will she? The room waited. Aiden was still watching the storm. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become something other than a pause. The original council decision was made without my direct authorization, he said finally. His voice was even, deliberate. The room went very still. Drevin kept his expression neutral, though something tightened behind his ribs. He had been the one to call that vote. Aiden had been dealing with a border skirmish in the south, and the timing had been, as he had explained at the time, a matter of urgent necessity. My lord, you were not absent in disagreement. You simply were not present. The council acted with your standing authority during your absence, as it is entitled to do. I am aware of what the council is entitled to do. Aiden turned from the window. His amber eyes were still, the way still water was still. Not calm, but held. I am also aware that this discussion is premature. Lottie stays until Bryn clears the children. That is the only decision I have made tonight. Drevin inclined his head. Of course, my lord. The council adjourned without further words. Sina caught Drevin in the corridor outside, and he had the distinct impression she had been waiting to do exactly that. You called that vote, she said, low and direct, when they were far enough from the chamber. 2 years ago, it was you. He looked at her without alarm. It was the council. You led it. Everyone knows it. Her dark eyes were steady. Why? Drevin considered her. She was young, and she was smart, a more inconvenient combination than most people realized. She was an unranked Omega with no family, no alliance, and no special value to the pack. The Alpha was newly crowned and surrounded by factions looking for weakness, an attachment to someone of no strategic value. She's not nothing, Sina said sharply. She wasn't, Drevin agreed pleasantly. But she was nothing of use. And in difficult times, the distinction matters. He straightened his cuffs and offered Sina a small, respectful nod. Good night, counselor. He walked away down the corridor, the gold ring turning and turning on his finger. Behind him, Sina stood in the torchlight, very still, her jaw set hard. She was thinking about a woman who had walked 3 miles through a blizzard with 3 children she had no obligation to carry, about the way Aiden's voice had changed, imperceptibly perhaps to anyone who hadn't been listening closely, when he said she stays. About the way Drevin had described Lottie without once calling her a person, the way people spoke about tools they'd set aside. She was also thinking about what it meant that she, Sina, had been the one skeptical of Lottie's return tonight, and about how quickly that skepticism had begun to sit uncomfortably. She did not return to bed. Instead, she went to the east corridor and stood outside the door of the healer's room, listening to the small, steady sounds of 3 children breathing on the other side of it. Safe. Whole. Because of a woman the council had decided was nothing. When Sina finally turned to go, she passed the door to the guest room in the north wing. A thin line of firelight showed beneath it, still burning. Either Lottie hadn't slept yet, or the fire had simply kept going without anyone to tend it. Sina paused. Then she moved on. She had questions. Too many, and not yet the shape to put them in. But she was beginning to understand that Counselor Drevin's careful answers had gaps in them the size of 3 years of silence, and that whatever those gaps contained had very much not finished unfolding. By the time she reached her own room, she had already decided one thing with certainty. She was going to watch Drevin more carefully. Starting at dawn. She just didn't know yet what she was afraid she might find. Chapter 5. What 2 years' silence. The storm had softened by morning, though it hadn't entirely released its grip on the mountain. Snow still fell, quieter now, in the slow and deliberate way that meant it intended to continue for some time. The great hall smelled of oat porridge and wood smoke, and the pack moved through its morning routines with the loosened, relieved quality of people who had spent the night fearing the worst and woken to find it hadn't come. Lottie had been awake since before dawn. She had washed her face in the basin, dressed in the borrowed clothes, and sat by the dying fire in her room until the light beneath the shutters changed from black to gray. Then she had folded the wool blanket with care, set it at the foot of the bed, and gone to find Bryn. The healer was already in her room with the children when Lottie arrived. All 3 were awake. The little boy, whose name she now learned was Finn, sat upright in his cot with a bowl of porridge balanced on his knees and a look of tremendous self-importance on his small face, as if surviving a blizzard were something he had always intended to do. The girl, Petra, had her bandaged hand held carefully against her chest and was interrogating Bryn about whether the stitches would leave a scar. The eldest boy, Cale, was asleep again, deeply and peacefully, with his mouth slightly open. Maren, the grandmother, sat between Finn and Petra, with her silver hair unbraided and a blanket over her lap. She looked up when Lottie appeared in the doorway, and something happened in her face that Lottie didn't know what to do with. A recognition that was also a kind of grief, warm and sorrowful at the same time. "Come in," Maren said. "I only wanted to see how they were," Lottie said, staying in the doorway. "I know." Maren patted the empty chair beside her. "Come in anyway." Lottie came in. Finn looked up from his porridge and studied her with the frank appraisal only very young children manage without cruelty. "You're the one who carried me," he announced. "Yes." He considered this, spooning porridge with great concentration. "My back was cold," he said, "but your back was warm." "Good," Lottie said. He nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his breakfast. Petra leaned around Maren to examine Lottie more thoroughly. "Grandmother said you used to live here." "Petra," Maren said softly. "It's all right," Lottie said. "Yes, a long time ago." Petra's brow furrowed. "Why did you leave?" The room was quiet except for the fire and Cale's steady breathing. "Sometimes people leave," Lottie said carefully, "because they're told it's what's best for everyone." Petra absorbed this with the serious consideration of a child who knew adults said complicated things with simple words. Was it? Best for everyone? Bryn made a quiet sound behind them that might have been a cough, or might have been something else entirely. "I don't know yet," Lottie said honestly. She stayed for a while longer, because Maren held her hand, and wouldn't let go of it without making a scene, and because Finn fell asleep halfway through his porridge, and she found herself smoothing the blanket over him with a steadiness she hadn't felt in a long time. When she finally stood to leave, Bryn followed her into the corridor and pressed a small bundle of dried herbs into her hand without a word. Warming medicine, the kind that cleared the lungs after cold exposure. For later. Lottie was tucking it into her pocket when she turned and found Aiden standing at the end of the corridor. He was alone. No council members, no guards, just him, in a plain dark tunic with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking like a man who had not slept and had stopped pretending otherwise. "Walk with me," he said. He took her to the eastern courtyard. It was sheltered from the worst of the wind by the high stone walls on 3 sides, and someone had cleared the snow from the central path at some point in the night, though it had begun to fill in again. Their boots crunched softly through the thin, fresh layer as they walked. The cold was clean, rather than brutal. The particular silence of a winter morning after a storm, when the world hadn't decided yet what the day would be. Neither of them spoke for the first circuit of the courtyard. Lottie had trained here, years ago. She knew the way the light came over the eastern wall in winter, pale and sideways, making the stone glow amber for exactly 20 minutes before it climbed too high and turned white. She hadn't known she remembered that until the light did it now, and something in her chest moved in a way she hadn't braced for. "I didn't know," Aiden said. She kept walking. About the vote? Not until 2 days after it was done. His voice was measured, but the words beneath the measurement were not. I came back from the border settlement and Dreven told me it had been handled, that the council had determined a reallocation of status was necessary for pack stability, and that you had been informed and had departed without incident. A pause. He made it sound administrative. Lottie was quiet for a moment. The snow crunched. A bird moved in the bare branches above the eastern wall, and you accepted that. I questioned it, but you accepted it. The silence that followed had a shape to it. Aiden stopped walking. She stopped 2 steps later and turned to look at him. He was not defensive. She had prepared herself for defensiveness, for the elaborate self-justification of a man who needed to be right. What she found instead was something worse, because it was harder to be angry at. He looked like a man who had spent 2 years being unable to forgive himself and had gotten very tired of carrying it. I accepted it, he said quietly. I told myself it was already done, that reversing a council decision so soon after taking leadership would create fractures the pack couldn't afford, that I would find another way to... He stopped, looked at the snow. There was no other way. I chose the pack over the right thing, and I have known that every day since. Lottie studied the line of his profile. The scar on his jaw caught the pale winter light. She thought about saying she forgave him. She thought about saying she didn't. Neither felt exactly true, and she had learned, living alone for 2 years, that the only things worth saying were the true ones. You should know, she said, that I didn't come back last night for you. I know that. I came back because of 3 children in the snow. If it had been a stranger's hall with warm lights, I would have knocked on that door instead. I know that too. She searched his face. Then what is it you want to say to me, Aiden? Because you didn't bring me to an empty courtyard at dawn to confess something I can't unknow, and then walk away. The amber in his eyes deepened. He turned toward her fully, and the morning light caught him square, and she could see all of it. The grief, the weariness, the careful hope that he was keeping at a very controlled distance, because he knew he hadn't earned anything more. I want to ask you to stay, he said. Not because of last night. Not because of the children. Not for the pack. He held her gaze without flinching. Because 2 years ago, something was taken from you without my authorization, and I would like to offer it back. Your place here. Your status. A home. Lottie was very still. The snow fell between them in slow, indifferent silence. That is a significant offer, she said carefully, from a man whose counsel has not changed. Something moved in his jaw. The council does not make this offer. I do. And Dreven? His silence answered her. He'll fight it, she said. Yes. And you're willing to have that fight. He looked at her as if the question were already answered and had been for some time. Yes. She turned away and walked another step and stopped. The eastern wall rose before her, stone worn smooth by decades of shoulders resting against it. She had rested against this very wall at 17, watching the older hunters train, wanting so badly to be of use to something larger than herself. She had carried that wanting for years. Into training, into pack work, into the small hopeful spaces of belonging before the council took them away. She had spent 2 years learning to want smaller things, quieter things, things that couldn't be voted away. I'll stay, she said, through the storm, until the children are cleared by Bryn, and we will see what happens after that. It was not a yes. It was not a no. Aiden breathed out slowly. That's enough, he said. And from the way he said it, she understood he meant it completely. Chapter 6. What moves in the margins. Senna found the discrepancy before midday. She had spent the morning in the pack's record room, a low, narrow space off the council corridor, lined with shelves of bound ledgers that smelled of old leather and tallow. The archivist, a quiet older man named Pedder, had given her access without question. She was a counselor. Counselors had access. She pulled the records from 3 years ago, 2 years ago, cross-referenced them. She found what she was looking for in 40 minutes, which told her it had never been particularly well hidden, only hidden from people who weren't looking. The formal record of Lottie's rejection listed the cause as PAC destabilization risk, unanchored status, no viable alliance, standard language, clean. But 3 months before that vote, there was a separate record, a resource allocation document, dull as dust, that listed a proposed revision to the Eastern Territory grazing rights. The revision would have benefited 4 specific family holdings. All 4 of those families had council representation. All 4 of their councilors had voted in favor of rejection. And attached to that same document, in a different ink and a different hand, was a note so brief it looked like an afterthought. Omega L. Possible obstacle to Eastern consolidation. Loyalty unclear. Recommend reassessment. No signature. But Sina had spent enough time with council documents in 4 months to recognize Dreven's handwriting by the particular way he formed his letters. Precise, unhurried, a little too careful. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the record room, listening to the snow tap against the small high window. Then she closed the ledger and sat with what she had found. Lottie had not been rejected because she was a liability. She had been rejected because she was in the way. Because she had lived and worked in the Eastern Territory, knew its people, and was beginning to build the kind of quiet trust that unranked Omegas weren't supposed to build. The kind that made consolidation more difficult. The kind that made certain land agreements more complicated to push through without question. Dreven had removed a person as if she were a fence post inconveniently placed, and he had done it while the Alpha King was 4 days' ride south, managing a border skirmish that Sina now found herself wondering had been as urgent as reported. She stood up. Her legs were steady. Her hands were steady. She was the kind of angry that burned cold and even, which was the most useful kind. She was also, she realized, the kind of frightened that comes from understanding that the person who removed Lottie 2 years ago without consequence was still sitting at the council table, still turning that gold ring, still being indispensable and invisible in equal measure. And Lottie was inside the walls again. Sina tucked the relevant ledger under her arm and went to find Aiden. She was halfway down the corridor when she passed Dreven going the other direction, his hands clasped behind his back, unhurried as always. He glanced at the ledger under her arm and then at her face, and something passed through his expression so quickly that she would have missed it if she hadn't been looking for exactly that. He knew she'd been in the records room. He knew what she'd found. He smiled at her pleasantly, inclined his head, and walked on. Sina kept walking. She did not look back, but she held the ledger tighter, and she moved faster. And by the time she reached the corridor outside Aiden's study, she was certain of something she hadn't been certain of at dawn. Whatever Dreven had done 2 years ago to Lottie, he had done it without hesitation and without remorse. And now that Lottie had returned, now that Aiden had looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the Great Hall, and said she stays in a voice that settled the room like an anchor, Dreven would be calculating his next move. Sina raised her hand and knocked. "My lord," she would say, "I found something, and I think we're running out of time." The door opened. She walked in. Chapter 7. The truth has a weight to it. Aiden read the ledger twice. He sat behind his desk with the leather cover open before him, and Sina stood to the side of the window and said nothing while he read. The fire in his study burned steadily. Outside, the snow continued in its quiet, indifferent way. The only sound in the room was the faint creak of the building settling against the cold, and the slow turn of a page. When he finished the second reading, he closed the ledger. He did not speak immediately. Sina had learned, in 4 months of watching him lead, that Aiden's silences were not empty. They were where he did the most important thinking, and interrupting them produced worse decisions. So she waited, her arms loose at her sides, her jaw set. "The border skirmish," he said finally. "I've been thinking about that too," Sina said. He looked up. His amber eyes were very still. "Dreven was the one who sent word south to you," she said, "about the severity of the situation. He was the one who advised you to ride immediately, and leave the council operating under standing authority. She paused. I haven't confirmed it yet, but I intend to. The muscle in Aiden's jaw worked once. Slowly. He manufactured a reason to remove me from the hall. Or he saw an opportunity and used it. Sina kept her voice level. Either way, the result is the same. The vote was called while you were gone. Lottie was out before you returned. By the time you were back and questioning it, the decision was recorded, the pack had adjusted, and reversing it would have required publicly undermining your own council in your first month of leadership. Aiden stood up. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, the way he'd stood the night before during the council meeting. But there was nothing controlled about his stillness now. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands had found the window frame and pressed against the stone. She knew the Eastern Territory, he said quietly. She'd spent 3 years building trust with the old family holdings out there. When I took over, those families were the most resistant to consolidating grazing management under pack authority. They trusted her. He stopped. The words sat in the air. Drevin needed them compliant. She made them confident instead. She made them feel protected, Sina said, which is the opposite of what Drevin required. Another silence. Longer. I need to tell her, Aiden said. Sina had expected this. She had also expected the note of dread underneath it, the particular quality of a man who knew that the truth he was about to deliver was going to cause pain regardless of how carefully he carried it. She deserves to know, she agreed. All of it. Not just that the vote was political, the reason behind it, what they saw in her that made them afraid. He turned from the window. His face had resolved into something harder than grief and quieter than fury. The expression of a man who had made a decision that was going to cost him something, and had made it anyway. Find her, he said. Bring her here. And Sina. He met her eyes. Thank you. Sina picked up the ledger from his desk and held it a moment. Don't thank me yet, she said. Drevin knows I found this. He looked at what I was carrying in the corridor. She set the ledger back down with deliberate care. He's already planning his next step. Then we move first. Yes. She turned toward the door. My lord. For what it's worth, I was wrong about her last night. I want that on record. Aiden looked at her steadily. It's noted. She left. Lottie was in the eastern courtyard again when Sina found her. She had swept snow from the low stone bench along the wall. The same bench where she had sat for hours years ago, sharpening blades and listening to the older hunters argue about technique. And was sitting with her hands wrapped around a clay cup of something hot, her borrowed wool cloak around her shoulders, her dark hair loose against the cold. She looked, Sina thought, like someone who had found a quiet corner of something, and was deciding whether to let herself rest in it. She looked up when Senna approached. She did not look alarmed, only watchful, with the particular watchfulness of someone who had learned to read arrivals carefully. He wants to speak with you, Sina said. I assumed he would. Lottie stood, set the cup on the bench. Is it the kind of conversation I should brace for? Sina considered lying. She discarded it. Yes. Lottie was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, straightened her shoulders, and followed. They walked side by side through the corridor in silence. Sina was not by nature a woman who offered comfort through words. She was more useful in action, in practicality, in the frank acknowledgement of difficulty. But somewhere between the record room and this moment, something had shifted in her understanding of the woman walking beside her, and it made the silence feel insufficient. He didn't abandon you, Sina said abruptly. I need you to know that before you go in there. It's more complicated than that, and more terrible in some ways, but it was not indifference. Lottie walked 3 more steps before responding. What was it? Go in, Sina said. Let him tell you. He told her everything. He stood on the other side of his desk and told her without softening it. The ledger, the note in Draven's hand, the Eastern Territory, the families, The grazing rights, the border skirmish that may or may not have been real, the timing that was too precise to be coincidence. He told her what Senna had found, and what he had concluded, and what he believed had been done to her and why. He watched her face while he told her. She stood very still through all of it. Her hands were at her sides, loose, and her expression was the controlled, surface-level calm of someone managing something large in a small space. He had seen that particular control on her face the night before in the great hall, when 40 people turned to look at her, and she had lifted her chin and refused to look away first. He understood it better now. It was not coldness. It was the practiced steadiness of a person who had survived things by refusing to let them take her face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. 3 years, she said finally. I spent 3 years in the Eastern Territory, learning those families, learning the land, learning what they needed and what they feared, and how to speak with them in ways they could trust. She paused. I loved that work. The word loved sat in the room between them, quiet and precise, and it cost her something to say it. He could see that. I know, he said. Drevin saw that and decided it was a threat. Yes. To the land deal. Yes. She turned away from him and walked to the window, stood with her back to him, looking out at the snow. Her fingers found the edge of the window frame, and he watched them press there gently, not gripping, just feeling the stone. He turned the thing I was proudest of into the reason I was removed, she said. Quiet, not bitter. Something beyond bitterness, where the anger had burned long enough to become something more like knowledge. That's what he did. Yes, Aiden said. That's exactly what he did. She was silent again. Outside, a wind moved through the courtyard and lifted a thin sheet of snow from the wall. It dissolved before it reached the ground. And the land deal? She asked. It went through. 6 months after you were gone. The Eastern families were easier to persuade once there was no one there they trusted who might ask questions. She absorbed this. He waited. He's still at your table, she said. Not for much longer. She turned then. Her dark eyes found his, and he held them without flinching, because she deserved someone who would look directly at the weight of what had been done without looking away from it. You can't simply remove him. He has allies. Removing him publicly, without evidence he'll accept as legitimate, fractures the council, and the council fractures the pack. He stared at her. How do you... I spent 3 years learning how these things work. Something crossed her face that might, in another moment, have been the beginning of a small, exhausted smile. Drevin is not the only one who paid attention. He was quiet, then carefully. What would you do? She looked at him for a long moment. Let me think about it. It was not the answer he'd expected, which told him something important. Lottie, he said. She stopped, halfway to the door. I'm sorry, for 2 years ago, for what was taken from you. I cannot make it smaller than it was by saying the words, but I am saying them. Her hand rested on the doorframe. Her back was to him. I know, she said. I know you are. A pause, softer. That does something, Aiden. I just don't know yet what. She walked out. He stood in the empty study and breathed. Chapter 8. Before the fire breaks. Drevin moved at dusk. Sina saw it first, the way he left the hall earlier than usual, pausing to speak quietly with 2 of the older council members near the western hearth, his hand on each of their shoulders in turn, unhurried and warm. She had learned to read his body language in the weeks since joining the council, and she recognized this particular posture, the gentle, thorough work of a man building consensus in advance of a decision he had already made. She followed him at a distance he could not see, and traced his path through 2 corridors and down to the lower hall, where 4 of the Eastern Territory's senior hunters sat over a late meal. He joined their table, stayed for 20 minutes, left without looking back. Sina went directly to find Lottie. She found her in the healer's corridor, outside the door where the children slept, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up, working through something in her head with the focused, inward expression of a person calculating a path through difficult terrain. "He's building a case," Sina said, dropping to sit beside her without preamble. "Not against Aiden. Against you. He's going to move before Aiden can bring the ledger to a full council session. He'll present you as an unauthorized entry, a rejected Omega who crossed the boundary and was given shelter without proper council approval. He'll make the children incidental. He'll make you the question instead." Lottie was quiet for a moment. "He'll call for a formal review of my presence, which he controls the outcome of," Sina said, "because he has 4 votes minimum before the session even opens. And Aiden has 4 as well, if you're counted. 5 if Bryn is called. She has medical standing and formal reviews." Sina glanced at her sideways. "That leaves 2 undecided. Drevin will have spoken to them tonight." "We need to speak to them first," Lottie said. "I know." Sina paused. "I don't know if we have enough time." Lottie turned her head and looked at Sina directly. Something had settled in her expression since this afternoon. She was still composed, but the composure had changed quality. It wasn't survival steadiness anymore. It was something more deliberate, chosen rather than necessary. "I know something about both of them," Lottie said. "Councillor Fenn lost his youngest daughter to cold sickness 3 winters ago. He advocated for extended healer coverage to the outer settlements for years and was overruled. And Councillor Brea was one of the Eastern Territory families. She grew up 2 miles from the ridge where I used to work." She met Sina's eyes. "She knows what I did there. She just hasn't had a reason to say so." The corridor was very quiet. Sina looked at the woman sitting beside her on the cold stone floor. Borrowed clothes, no rank, no status, no formal standing in this hall, 2 years of exile behind her, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel last night when that door had opened and she'd seen who was carrying those children. Something very close to respect. Deep and uncomplicated. "You were always going to come back, weren't you?" Sina said. It was not quite a question. Lottie was quiet for a moment. "I didn't plan it," she said honestly. "I was content out there. More than I expected to be." She glanced at the door where Finn and Petra and Kale were sleeping on the other side, safe and warm. "But some things find you regardless." "We need to move now," Sina said, standing and offering her hand. Lottie looked at it. Then she took it and stood, and neither of them let go immediately. "Sina?" Lottie said. "Yes." "Thank you. For going into the record room." A beat. "You didn't have to look." Sina straightened. "Someone should have looked 2 years ago." She released Lottie's hand. "Let's go find Fenn and Brea before Drevin makes our night significantly more difficult." They went. Behind them, the door to the healer's room held its quiet, steady sounds of 3 children breathing in the dark. Safe. Whole. The fire in the corridor torch above them burned on, indifferent to politics and history, and all the complicated grief that passed beneath it, illuminating the path forward in the only way fire ever did. One small, honest circle of light at a time. Chapter 9. The Council Decides. The formal session was called for the following morning. Draven had moved quickly. Sena had to grant him that. By the time the pack woke to find the storm finally releasing its hold on the mountain, the notice had already been posted on the council board in precise, unhurried handwriting. Formal review of unauthorized entry and extended presence, Omega L, convened at the 9th hour. He hadn't used her full name. Lottie had stood in front of that board for a long moment in the early morning quiet, reading the words in the cold blue light of a sky that had finally cleared, and then she had straightened her collar, tucked her borrowed cloak closer, and gone to eat breakfast with Marin and the children. Finn had saved her a place at the table. She sat in it. The council chamber felt different with everyone present. 7 counselors arranged around the long oak table, Aiden at the head. Bryn had been formally called in her capacity as pack healer, and she sat to Aiden's right with her ink-stained hands folded and her expression the particular professional calm of a woman who had delivered difficult news for 30 years and wasn't afraid of a room. Sina sat 2 seats down, her spine straight, the ledger from the record room on the table before her. Drevin sat across from them both, composed and still, his gold ring catching the morning light as it turned and turned on his finger. Lottie stood at the far end of the table, not seated. There had been no chair offered to her, and she had not asked for one. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and her chin level, and she waited. Drevin opened without ceremony. He was at his most dangerous when he was pleasant, and he was very pleasant now, measured, reasonable, almost sorrowful. He outlined the situation with the careful neutrality of a man presenting facts he had no personal stake in. The boundary crossing, the extended stay beyond the initial emergency, the question of whether a rejected Omega's unauthorized presence set a precedent that undermined pack law. He said her name twice. Both times it sounded like a category rather than a person. He did not mention the children until Counselor Fenn asked him to. The children were the cause of entry, Drevin acknowledged graciously, and the pack is grateful. That gratitude is not in question. What is in question is whether gratitude constitutes legal standing. He spread his hands. It does not. Not under our current code. Then perhaps, said Counselor Fenn, in the careful voice of a man who had spent several hours the previous night in quiet conversation and had made a decision at the end of it, the current code requires examination. Drevin looked at him. Something shifted behind his eyes, the first hairline fracture in the pleasant surface. Counselor Brea spoke before he could respond. She was a small woman, with gray threaded through her dark hair, and the weathered hands of someone who had grown up working land, rather than sitting in chambers. I knew Lottie's work in the Eastern Territory, she said, before I was on this council. My family's holding bordered the deer trail where she used to conduct settlement checks. She paused. She knew the name of every family elder in 7 settlements. She knew which wells ran dry in summer and which needed clearing in autumn. She knew things that took years to learn, and she shared them freely. Another pause. I have wondered, since I joined this council, why someone like that was removed from a role she was clearly built for. I think perhaps today I should stop wondering and start asking. Drevin's ring stopped turning. Sina placed her hand flat on the ledger. I would like to enter this into the formal record, she said. It is a council document from 3 years prior. I believe it will assist the review. She opened it to the relevant page and passed it to Aiden. He read the passage aloud. Not all of it, only the note, in Drevin's hand, attached to the Eastern Territory Resource Document. Omega L. Possible obstacle to Eastern consolidation. Loyalty unclear. Recommend reassessment. 7 words of handwriting connecting a land deal to the removal of a person. The room was completely still. Drevin said nothing for a long moment. Then, that note reflects a legitimate strategic concern about pack resources. It was written in your hand, Aiden said. Quietly. Absolutely. 3 months before a vote you called in my absence, while I was managing a border situation whose severity you personally reported to me. A situation I have since been unable to verify with the settlement commanders who were supposedly involved. He set the ledger down with the deliberate care of someone setting down something that had been too heavy for too long. This council will not be reviewing Lottie's presence today. It will be reviewing yours. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Not the held breath of uncertainty, but the exhale of something that had needed to break for a long time finally breaking. Drevin looked around the table. He was calculating. She could see it. The rapid interior movement behind the pleasant mask. He looked at Fenn, who did not look away. He looked at Brea, who was watching him with the steady, patient eyes of a woman who had spent years waiting for this conversation. He looked at Sina, who returned his gaze with perfect calm. The ring stopped turning. I have served this pack for 30 years, he said finally. His voice was still even, but the pleasantness had gone out of it entirely, leaving something thinner underneath. "You have," Aiden said. "And the record of those 30 years will be reviewed in full, in a formal inquiry, beginning tomorrow. Your counsel standing is suspended pending that inquiry." He met Draven's eyes. "You are not dismissed. You will have full opportunity to respond to every finding. But you will not sit at this table until the inquiry concludes." Draven rose. He straightened his cuffs with precise, unhurried movements. A man who would not let a room see him stumble. He inclined his head to Aiden with something that might have been, in some stripped and exhausted version of itself, respect. Then he walked out. The door closed behind him. The room breathed. Aiden looked at Lottie. She had not moved from the end of the table. She stood in the same position, hands loose, chin level, the borrowed cloak around her shoulders. But something had changed in her face. The composed surface was still there, but beneath it, something had eased. Not dramatically. Just the particular easing of someone who has been holding their breath for 2 years and has finally, quietly, been permitted to stop. "Lottie," Aiden said. His voice had changed quality entirely. "This council formally acknowledges that the vote of 2 years prior was conducted under circumstances that did not meet the standards of legitimate process, and that its outcome has caused significant and unjust harm." He paused. "Your status, your place, and your standing in this pack are formally restored, with full council record." He looked around the table. 6 hands, one by one, placed flat on the oak surface in the old sign of formal assent. Sina's was the first. Epilogue: What the Snow Left Behind. Spring came slowly to the mountain that year, the way it always did. Not in a single decision, but in a series of small ones. A day that was almost warm. A morning where the snow retreated another foot from the southern wall. A week when the frozen creek at the edge of the eastern territory shivered and began to remember how to move. Lottie learned to recognize the pack's sounds again, not as an outsider listening from beyond the boundary line, cataloging them as things that belong to other people, but the way you learn the sounds of a house you live in, the particular creak of the corridor in cold weather, the way the great hall quieted just before meals, and then broke open again with voices and the scrape of benches, the sound of children running in the eastern courtyard on the first morning. It was warm enough to run without their breath clouding too thick to see through. Finn ran the fastest. He also fell down the most spectacularly, and picked himself up each time with the focused dignity of a boy who had survived a blizzard at 4 and considered himself experienced in difficult conditions. Petra's hand healed cleanly, with a thin silver scar across her palm that she showed to anyone willing to look. Kale, the eldest, had developed the particular solemn protectiveness of a boy who had been terrified out of his certainty and come back from it with something steadier. He watched his younger siblings with careful eyes, and watched Lottie with the frank gratitude of a child who didn't know yet how to say the words, but showed it in the small, persistent ways children do. Marin planted lavender along the eastern wall in late spring. She had done it every year for 40 years, she said, and she intended to do it for 40 more. Bryn signed the Eastern Settlement health reports for the first time in 3 years, with a second name alongside hers, Lottie's. The arrangement was informal at first, then it wasn't, then it was simply the way things were done, and no one discussed it further. Sina did not soften exactly. She was not a woman built for softening, but she found, in the weeks and months that followed, that she had developed the specific habit of stopping by the eastern courtyard in the early mornings, where Lottie often sat with her tea in the pale winter light. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they sat in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who had decided, without stating it, that they trusted each other. It was, Sina thought, not so different from the silence she shared with her closest hunters before a difficult morning's work. The kind where you don't need words, because the decision to be present is already the whole statement. The inquiry into Draven's conduct lasted 6 weeks. Its findings were thorough, recorded in full, and sealed in the council archives. Draven was removed from his position without further ceremony. He did not fight it. He departed the pack settlement quietly in early spring, with a single horse and a travel pack, and the gate closed behind him, in the unremarkable way gates do when they are simply doing what gates are built for. Peter, the archivist, noted the departure in the record with his usual precision and returned to his ledgers. It was Aidan who told Lottie, on a morning in late spring, when the snow had finally retreated entirely from the courtyard and the stone was warm enough to sit on. He told her simply, without ceremony, standing with his back to the wall she'd once learned against as a girl, the sky above them a clear and uncomplicated blue. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked out at the courtyard, the cleared ground, the lavender beginning to push up in the far corner, the sound of Finn's voice carrying from somewhere beyond the eastern wall. "Is it strange," she asked, "that I don't feel what I thought I would feel?" "What did you think you'd feel?" She considered. Satisfaction, maybe. Or something like it. She shook her head slightly. "I feel finished. The way you feel after you've carried something a long way, and you've finally been allowed to set it down." Aidan was quiet beside her. The morning moved around them. A bird somewhere, the distant sound of the pack beginning its day, the lavender finding the sun. "I promised you something," he said, "the morning in this courtyard. When you said you would stay through the storm." He paused. "You have stayed considerably longer than that." "I have," she agreed. "I have not asked you, formally, what you intend." His voice was careful, but not controlled. The difference being that controlled was a door held shut, and careful was a door held open. "I am asking now." She turned her head and looked at him, the scar along his jaw in the spring light, the amber eyes that had never quite managed to look at her without saying more than he intended. The man who had made a wrong choice and had been honest about it, and had spent months earning back something she hadn't been sure was earnable. "I intend to be here," she said simply. "In the Eastern Territory in the mornings, at Marin's table for Sunday meals, at Bryn's side for the spring settlement round." She held his gaze. "Here, Aidan. I intend to be here." He reached out and took her hand, carefully. "The way you take something you know is valuable." She let him. His hand was warm and rough and entirely certain, and she understood at last what it felt like to be known by something and to allow that knowing to remain. They sat in the courtyard for a long time, while the mountain spring moved around them, and the lavender opened, and the pack went about its living, and the snow that had carried everything to this moment melted quietly into the ground and fed the roots of what came next. It was enough. It was, finally, entirely enough.